Hello everyone. If you're a regular follower of the channel, or of my Twitter, indeed, you will be aware that I've kind of got into roguelikes over the last maybe year, 18 months or so. And that's one of the main types of game I play at the moment. Another thing I've been doing a lot lately is watching the Dice Tower, which is a YouTube video collection about tabletop games. And they do a lot of top 10 lists. And at the moment, they're in the middle of doing the top 100 tabletop games of all time for each of their primary hosts. And I've been watching a lot of those lately, and it's just been sort of niggling at me over the last couple of weeks, a nagging idea, thinking, you know what, why don't I do my top 10 roguelikes ever? So here it is. In the background at the moment, for those who may not be aware, is Rogue. The original. Well, there's a little bit of debate about whether it's strictly the original. It's generally accepted that Rogue is the original roguelike game. I mean, it gave rise to that name for a start. But there are a couple of other games, things like Telengard, which were approximately contemporary. I mean, I was an infant at the time, so I have no recollection of it myself, but people who were there, I've heard people who were there remark on both sides of that. Some say Telengard came first, some say it came slightly after. But regardless of the exact timing, Rogue was certainly in the first maybe 2 or 3 games that were procedurally generated dungeon crawls of some description. And it's certainly the one that has set the template for everything that came afterwards. You know, things like the major ones like NetHack and Angband, all the way up to the very modern ones like Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup and Dungeon Mans and Dungeons of Dreadmore and lots of other things that have dungeon in the title. They all resemble Rogue more than they resemble something like Telengard. So Rogue is probably the first and certainly the template. So here in the background we have a bit of Rogue. I'll probably have inserted a bit of Telengard there as well, if I remember to do that. But anyway, this isn't a history lesson about the roguelike. I will leave that to people more expert than I am. In fact, I'd recommend checking out the episode of the Roguelike Radio podcast that talks about the history and future of the roguelike genre. But for now, this is my top 10 roguelikes. For now. As I said, the Dice Tower has inspired this list, and what they tend to do is a top 100 games for their hosts each year. Which initially seemed silly. Like, how can it be the top 100 ever if it changes every year? But it's kind of, this year, this is my top list to date. So it can change from year to year as your tastes change and some fall out of favour and new ones rise and so on. So this list, my top 10 roguelikes, is not the same list it would have been a year ago. There were games I would have put on this list a year ago that are not here now. And I'm sure it's not the same list that it will be this time next year. But for now, September 2014, this is the Indie Ocean's top 10 roguelikes. Number 10 is a roguelike that's inspired by a much more well-known franchise. Now, I'm assuming it's unofficial. I'm assuming they've never written to the publisher or developer to get permission for this, but like the majority of roguelikes, it's a non-profit project. It's downloadable for free, it's not being sold, and it's a work in progress. So I think for the most part, even if the publisher or developer of the mainstream series knew about the existence of this game, they would not really mind. This game is Rogue's Souls. As you might guess, it's inspired by the Dark Souls/Demon's Souls franchise, which, like roguelikes, is notorious for being extremely difficult. This game does have some problems which prevent it rising higher up on this list. It just scraped in at 10. It was in contention with maybe 2 other games for the number 10 spot. it could have been higher up, except that the newest version of Rogue Souls does have a tendency to crash. It throws up weird error messages from time to time, and it never used to do that. It seems to be the latest version. But this game is still in development. It still gets updates from time to time. And it incorporates the Dark Souls mechanisms into a roguelike surprisingly well. A lot of roguelikes that are based on other properties, whether they're other game franchises or films or TV or whatever, just kind of slap a theme on it. I'm thinking here of things like Hellbound. Hellbound is actually pretty good. It's probably my favourite of the Angband variants I've played. I'm not going to go into what Angband variants are here. But Hellbound is probably my favourite of them. But mostly it just slaps a Dante's Inferno theme on top of Angband mechanics. It's not just that, but that is a large part of it. Rogue Souls, on the other hand, actually incorporates a lot of meaningful stuff from Dark Souls. I think it's more inspired by Demon's Souls, but I've never played that. I've never played Dark Souls either, but I've watched it played. So in Rogue Souls, obviously you get a procedurally generated layout. It's basically a dungeon crawl going from floor to floor, and it's tough. But there are things that have been brought in from Dark Souls. So there is a stamina bar. Anytime you perform an attack, possibly also a spell, although I'm not sure, but certainly anytime you attack, anything like that, you drain stamina. And your stamina does slowly creep back up as you're walking around, but the best way to get it back is to just wait on the spot. And your stamina depletes very quickly as you're attacking, which means that it's not at all practical to take on great groups of enemies, because they will rapidly deplete your stamina and you won't be able to fight them anymore. Even fighting one enemy at a time can run down your stamina before you manage to kill the enemy. So combats often become very much about positioning and manoeuvring as you charge in, strike a few blows, and then back off before you lose all of your stamina, and try to dodge round corners and get a bit of distance between you and the enemy to allow you to get your stamina back and go back in for another attempt. And that brings a nice twist to roguelike combat, which you often don't get. Some other games do provide that kind of tactical positioning element, but not that many. And Rogue Souls does it in a very neat, compact, and quite clean way that makes sense. You can see your stamina bar depleting, and you can see it regenerating when you back off. So I think that works very well. A couple of other things as well. So you buy things using souls, which you sometimes just find in chests and such, or sometimes you pick them up from fallen enemies, that kind of thing. So you trade in souls for upgrades to your stats, and also you trade them to shopkeepers to buy items and equipment and that kind of thing. Estus flasks as well make an appearance. Unlike most roguelikes, waiting and resting don't heal you. You have to expend your flasks. And you have a limited supply of them, which can only be refilled at certain spots, which tend to occur every few floors. So it does pull in all these elements from the Dark Souls games and incorporates them into a roguelike in quite a satisfying and mechanically sound way. As I said, it would have been higher up the list if not for the fact that it tends to throw up these almost game-breaking error messages for no apparent reason. I haven't spotted any pattern to them. But nonetheless, I do recommend trying out Rogue Souls if the idea of putting a bit more thought into combat than just bumping into enemies and trying to tough it out appeals to you. It's definitely not an epic, strategic, plan 5 years ahead kind of game like NetHack, which is good because that generally annoys me. But it is very much an action combat focused kind of game. But there's also a bit of things like hunting for keys to unlock the exit and that kind of stuff. It plays differently to many other roguelikes, and I do recommend it if this sounds at all appealing. I will link all of the games below for anyone who's interested in checking them out. So that is number 10, Rogue Souls. On to number 9 then. And number 9 is one of a couple of instances of a particular roguelike developer appearing more than once on this list. I think there's one other example. So there are, I think, 2 games by this developer and 2 games by another developer on this list. This one is probably this developer's most famous game, his best-known game. It's not my favourite of his, but it is a good one. It's called Hyper Rogue. At the moment, I think the latest version is Hyper Rogue version 4. I could be mistaken, but I think it is. There have been several versions all the way back to Hyper Rogue 1 a few years ago. And for a long time, I didn't get why people liked Hyper Rogue. Hyper Rogue, incidentally, is an abbreviation of Hyperbolic Rogue, which is fundamental to the whole nature of the game. I didn't understand why people liked it. It's very visual, and the first thing you will notice when you open Hyper Rogue is the display. Your display area is a circle, like a disc, and you appear to be standing in the middle of this disc, and the whole surface is covered in, I think they're hexagons, but they're not even hexagons. They seem to be slightly distorted, not identical proportions every time, and they get smaller towards the edge of the disc. And as you move, the disc sort of scrolls around, so it looks a bit like you're walking on the surface of a globe. Little weird, but kind of nice, neat touch, and it boggles your eyes a bit. But when you look at this, you think, well, it must be tiny. I mean, look at the size of this disc. If it scrolls round when I walk, I'll get to the far side of the globe in no time at all. But that's not how it works. You walk for miles and never get to the other side. And one of the things I really didn't get about Hyper Rogue the first several times I played it, probably the first dozen or so times I played it, and I kept coming back for another go to try and work out what the fuss was about, was that it seemed to be a very arcadey sort of just grab pickups for points thing. There are items lying around, sort of star-shaped things and little orbs and stuff, depending on which area of the map you're in. And you grab them, and the game counts up how many of that type you've collected. And I thought, okay, so it's just grab as many as I can before enemies kill me? Wow, that's interesting. But it's a lot better than that. And it was only relatively recently, maybe a couple of months or so ago, that I got what it's about. I read something, I think it was actually a blog post or similar by the developer, Zeno. I think it was by him, that talked about what he'd been trying to do with the game and how hyperbolic geometry it can be used in a gameplay situation. And when I read that, I thought, oh, I get what you're doing with this. And suddenly the whole game became much more interesting to me. I'm not going to try and explain hyperbolic geometry. It's the basis of this whole game, but I don't get it. It's very mathematical. From what I can tell, it's, degree-level mathematics. And I'm bad with school-level mathematics. I'm good with words. I've always been more of a writer and a poet than a number cruncher. Numbers just don't make sense in my head in the way that words do. So I'm not going to even try to explain what hyperbolic geometry is, because I don't really get it myself. But in the game, the practical effect of having a hyperbolic world is that you appear on this disc, which looks a bit like an Escher work. I forget what the name of the piece is exactly. But I'll try and remember to link it below. It's a disc thing with what look like endlessly repeating fish stretching out to the horizon. So you get this disc that you're appearing on. Your guy's standing in the middle. Enemies are chasing you around. It's a kind of one-hit roguelike with a sort of checkmatey mechanic, where you can't move into a space where an enemy would kill you on the next turn. The only way you actually die and fail at the game is if you get into a checkmate position where any move you could make would be fatal. So there are no moves left for you to make and the game ends. So it prevents you making huge cock-ups, which you might imagine would make the game very easy, but it doesn't really. And someone just rode a loud motorbike past, if you heard that. Shut up, bike! I'm talking about Hyper Rogue. So the practical upshot of this hyperbolic geometry thing is that you can head off in any direction and you will never retrace your steps. Once you've gone more than a few spaces in any direction, it's almost impossible to retrace your steps back to where you were, because the world essentially expands exponentially as you walk. So you appear to be walking around a globe, but actually you're walking out into a virtually infinite world. And after a few steps, because of the shape, the weird-ass shape of the world and the way it expands around you, you can't retrace your steps. Even if you think you are going back along the same spaces, you're probably not after you've gone more than about 6 or 7 spaces. And this means that you can't retrace your steps, but it also means you don't revisit the same areas over and over. Generally, wherever you go is a new place, which really, really helps freshen up the game. And the thing with collecting items is, yes, you are just collecting numbers of items. Sometimes you'll come across an item that will give you an ability, like it'll enable you to tunnel through walls, or it will... There are other things like that damage enemies and that kind of thing. Not loads, but a few. They're not usable. They trigger automatically when you pick them up in a very arcadey way. My favourite is the one that lets you dig through walls. And you roam, picking up these little items that just make the counter tick up. But what that does is unlock new areas. When you've got so many pickups from so many areas, then a new area unlocks. When you've killed a certain number of enemies, then another area unlocks. And eventually, when you've collected enough items from enough areas, the final area, Hell, opens up. And then you have to try and collect an item within Hell. I have managed to get to Hell, but I've never actually finished the game. I didn't survive long enough to actually walk to Hell. I got killed on my way there. Because your path never repeats, finding your way back to an area you've been to before is really difficult. You just kind of wander and rely on stumbling across it by chance eventually. You always will if you walk for long enough. So Hyper Rogue it's definitely much more arcadey and actiony than the majority of roguelikes. And it feels unlike most other roguelikes because there's basically no inventory. And there's no sort of grinding for the most part. You don't get levels, character levels. You don't go from floor to floor. You just wander around one big world, moving from region to region, picking things up, with this faintly chess-like one-hit move thing between you and enemies, where you have to constantly maneuver to try not to be hemmed in. And the more items you pick up, the more enemies appear to chase you. And there are various different kinds of enemies, including expanding plants, which are a right pain. So once you get what Hyper Rogue is, it's a lot of fun. And it requires less thought than some more complex games, or games with a more complex interface. But it does still require a lot of concentration to actually get very far. And it's unlike any other roguelike. So that's Hyper Rogue by Zeno. As I said, I think the newest version is Hyper Rogue 4. That is my number 9. Number 8, then, in my top 10 roguelikes of all time so far, is the other first one of a pair. I mentioned in Hyper Rogue that developer has another game on this list, and that another developer also does. And this is one of those, if that makes sense. Anyway, it's called Princess RL. And apparently, it's inspired by the Princess Maker games. But I've never played the Princess Maker games. I'm not remotely familiar with them at all. What I am familiar with is this game. It's by Flend. I think his real name is Tom Ford. But I know him primarily as Flend, who tends to release 7-day roguelikes for that challenge, and they tend to be among the best and often most inventive of the entries in that contest. I've mentioned at least one of his games in some of my videos before. This is arguably his most well-known one. It's certainly the name I've heard mentioned the most, or seen mentioned the most, in places like the Roguelike subreddit. Princess RL is about being a princess, essentially. You're in a princess training school where you're learning the skills that will be necessary for you to be the princess of a kingdom. And these skills range from learning to dance, to gymnastics, to magic, and to combat. So it covers a variety of things. And you get different abilities depending on how much learning you put into each of these areas. And you only have a set amount of time. You can attend classes during the week. You must attend classes during the week. But then at weekends, you can rest, because if you work too hard, some of your stats start depleting. And I think it's one weekend a month you're able to sneak out of the school, because all of the teaching staff are away. You can sneak out of the school and go roaming the countryside to have adventures. Out in the countryside, you find dungeons and things. And in there, you can also level up your stats. So you can increase your stats through training and through adventuring. When you lose all of your health on an adventure, the school guards come and find you and drag you back to school. And the idea, basically, is to go through a year, the school year. And towards the end, something will happen. An event will occur that will require you to draw upon everything you've learned to have the biggest adventure so far. It's quite a small game, it's quite a short game. And it's not super difficult as roguelikes go, but it is moderately challenging for its length, and I believe it has multiple endings. Certainly I've seen 2, maybe 3 endings. I think 2 endings. One which was rubbish and one which was reasonably good, which I felt satisfied with. And you can get some replayability out of it, even once you've got a satisfactory ending, because you might want to try and see what other endings you can get. And also you can go for different princess builds. So, for instance, you could go for a very magic-heavy one, you could go for a very fighting-heavy one. Combat works really nicely in this. It seems to be drawn from another of Flen's games called DD Rogue, where you kind of perform special moves based on how you move. So, for instance, you trigger a particular attack by taking a swing at an enemy, then dodging around them and attacking from the other side. You end up striking extra blows against them, and things where you can flip off the wall and pass over your enemy's head, which is quite nice for an ASCII game. Obviously, you can't see that animation happening or anything, but it's a nice touch, and it really gives a lot more depth and tactical thought and skill to the combat system. Worked well in DD Rogue, where that was basically the focus of the game, but it reappears here for the combat system in Princess RL. So you could make a very brawly, physically focused princess, or a very spellcasty type. Things like the dancing class and that kind of stuff, etiquette class, I think, increase your charm, which seems like it would be redundant, because you'd think, actual princess skills, being charming, and mastering etiquette and dancing and courtly behaviour. No, it's actually very useful, because it allows you to charm certain enemies who will then follow you around and back you up in fights. And if you have very good charm skills, then you can let your minion do most of the fighting for you, and then when they get killed, just charm a new one and go through it that way. I ended up with a fairly balanced princess most of the time, but you can replay to focus on a more specialised princess if you want to. So that's Princess RL. It's, as I said, I think the best known of Flen's games. It's not my favourite, but it is really good. It's quite short, quite manageable, and not that complicated. And it's quite distinctive and unique, unlike other roguelikes, which you've probably noticed is a theme through my top 10 so far. It's generally a theme of my favourites of anything. I like things that are distinctive and feel like their own entity. So that's my number 8, Princess RL. Number 7 is a game you will actually have seen a bit of if you're a longer-term viewer of this channel. I did start a Let's Play of it, but I started to get frustrated. I was on the second easiest difficulty setting, and I still found it too tough. I have, since then, almost completely finished the game on the easiest setting. The final boss killed me. But there's quite a jump from the easiest setting to the second easiest out of 5. I can only get maybe halfway through the game on the second easiest setting. But you may have seen a few videos where I was attempting to Let's Play this, and this is Doom RL. That is Doom the Roguelike. Like Rogue Souls and in fact Princess RL, Doom RL is based on another franchise. Clearly, it's the very famous and very influential first-person shooter Doom, and it works surprisingly well. I mean, one of the reasons that it's such a strong contender, in my opinion, is that it incorporates the feel of Doom. Although it's a top-down, roguelike, procedurally generated dungeon crawl thing, turn-based and so on, with some inventory management and resource management and such, it incorporates a lot of the graphics and a lot of the music and sound effects of Doom, which is kind of cheating, admittedly, but it works really well. I've always loved the music of Doom and the overall feel of the game. Even now, I love the feel of playing Doom. And turning Doom into a roguelike actually works really, really well here. And it's got a lot of familiar encounters. So you run into the Barons of Hell a few floors down, you run into the Cyber Demon eventually, and so on. It's like playing through the original Doom, with some Doom 2 stuff thrown in, but doing it in a roguelike form. It's easier than a lot of roguelikes because it has variable difficulty, so you can set it to the easiest setting if you want and get through it without too much difficulty. There's still challenge there. As I said, I haven't completely finished it, even on that setting, but it is a lot more manageable. Or you can ramp it all the way up to the top difficulty if you want to, or anywhere in between. Nicely presented. Does have a bit of fiddly roguelike interface, you know, I for the inventory, F to shoot, R to reload. So it does have a bit of that keyboard wrangling stuff that a lot of roguelikes have going on. But for the most part, it's a very accessible, manageable, and not too head-bustingly difficult roguelike. It's one of the 3 that got me into the roguelike genre in the first place. Really strong contender. Recommended particularly for newcomers to the genre, but even if you're experienced, it's definitely worth having a play of Doom RL. Presentation is one of the things that sets it apart, but additionally, it's just a really enjoyable, fun game. And it cuts out some of the more tedious stuff that can get frustrating in a lot of roguelikes. All the items are identified, for instance. You don't have to do that thing where you swig a potion and your whole torso explodes because it was the wrong potion. So that's my number 7, Doom RL. Number 6 on my list is a relatively recent discovery, and if you've been following my Twitter account, @AlanWithT, for those of you not familiar, you will probably have seen me posting a fair number of screenshots and things from this game. Because funny things keep happening. It's not inherently a humorous game. There are others on this list that are, coming up later on. But this one isn't inherently humorous. It doesn't have gags flying around. But some of the stuff that happens is just funny. I found that there's an attack command. You mostly just bump into enemies to melee attack them, but I found there's an attack command on the keyboard. So I tried that out and thought, okay, well, I just attack. I wonder if I can attack that tree. So I used the attack command to attack a tree, and because I wasn't wielding a weapon at the time, it said, "You bite the tree." Yeah, and I've had seagulls attacking me, and you know, you kick the dead seagull on the wing and stuff like that. If you watch the message window at the bottom, there is some goofiness to it. I don't know whether that's intentional or not, but it does add a nice, memorable sort of aspect to this. Vapors of Insanity is... it's a game by Zeno. It's the second one. Zeno made Hyper Rogue. He also made Vapors of Insanity. And it's kind of abandoned. I have spoken briefly to Zeno about this over Twitter, and he said he had a lot of trouble getting anyone to show much interest in Vapors of Insanity. So he stuck with the project that was getting the most interest, which was Hyper Rogue. Vapors is more of an ambitious sort of epic roguelike. One of the... It sort of attempts to be like the major roguelikes, something like NetHack. It aims to have that kind of depth and complexity of interaction, which I've only just scraped the surface of. So it's very unwieldy to play, which is one of the big drawbacks. It's also unfinished. As I said, it's abandoned, so it's still quite early in its development, which means it can be kind of buggy. It's quite unbalanced in some respects. And the interface is an absolute nightmare. It's ridiculously convoluted. You can play with a mouse or with keyboard, but I find that there are some things you want to do that are so obtuse to get to that the best way to play is with mouse and keyboard together. For instance, moving with keyboard is a lot easier, but equipping items is easier with a mouse. So I do some things with the keyboard and some things with the mouse, which means constantly moving my hand back and forth between the number pad and the mouse. That's one of the biggest drawbacks of the game. And it's really convoluted to work out how to do some things. In order to charge up the uses of a wand, for instance, you have to pocket it. You can only pocket 4 items, at least at the start of the game. I don't know if that can increase later. But you have to put something in your pocket. Once you've put something in your pocket, it's really difficult to work out how to get it out again. If you want to free up that pocket space for something else, I don't want to keep this wand of peach creation or whatever in my pocket. I don't think that's a real wand in the game. But you've got some useless wand in your pocket. You want to take it out so you can use the space for something more practical, a wand of awesome. And working out how to get the damn thing back out of your pocket is an absolute headache. It took me weeks to work that out. And even now, I think I've forgotten how to do it. So it'll be an absolute nightmare the next time I try to do that, because I've completely forgotten. Very obscure, very obtuse interface. But I think that's a result of, 1, the fact that it's unfinished, and 2, the fact that it aims to have such depth and complexity of interactions between you and the environment, you and items and other items, and so on. Just as a very simple example, you can rub an orb on things in your inventory. You often find things like Orb of Reinforcement, and if you use the rub command to rub that on your, say, breastplate, then it will strengthen your breastplate. But at some point I wonder if there's a way to rub it on myself. So I fiddled around a bit with the inventories and the menus, and I found, if I do this, it does actually offer you as an option. Can't select yourself with the keyboard, but you can do it with the mouse. Again, the weird, clumsy interface. But I found, hey, there's a way I can rub orb on myself. So I rubbed it on myself, and it said, you now look stronger. Not sure exactly what the upshot of that was, but my point is that, like something like NetHack, which I actually don't like, this game allows you to think outside the box and to think, I wonder if I could try this. I wonder what would happen if. And although that makes it very complicated and kind of a steep learning curve, it is a really rewarding thing once you work something out. Even just finding that a thing is possible, even if you don't know what the effect was, like reinforcing myself, just discovering that it's possible to do that is really rewarding. There are a few other weird features about Vapors of Insanity which make it stand out. For instance, this isn't so weird, but there's a graphical version and an ASCII version, depending on your preferences. And actually, they both look really good. The graphical version isn't amazingly pretty, but it has a very distinctive look to it. And it's quite colourful, and everything looks kind of weird. but it means that Vapours of Insanity looks unlike any other game. The ASCII version looks like ASCII, but because of the way buildings and paths and such are built in the world, the way they're shaped, the ASCII version still has its own distinct feeling. It's quite distinctive. And at the same time, it still feels kind of like the graphical version. So that's a nice touch. But one of the really odd things about it, which apparently also appears in another of Zeno's games called Hydra Slayer, which I haven't played yet, is the ability to change the movement, or the sort of the space type. I'll explain what I mean. A lot of roguelikes have 8-way movement in a grid. Some have 4-way movement in a grid. Very occasionally, there'll be a game like something like Hoplite. I'm not sure how that's actually pronounced. It's a Greek word, but people call it Hoplite. In which you have hexes, so you have hexagonal movement. Vapours of Insanity allows you to choose from these 3. So if you choose either 4-way movement or 8-way movement, you'll have a basic grid of squares to move on, which will look very familiar. And it just determines whether you can only move in the 4 cardinal directions or the 8 sort of compass directions. Or you can select the hex version, which is the default, which gives you 6-sided spaces, obviously, which gives you 6-way movement, and it completely changes the shape of the game world, because suddenly everything's at weird angles to accommodate the hex structure, and it makes the game feel quite different, depending on which one you choose. And the fact that the game is built in such a way that it can cope with all of these different options is really impressive. It's also an open world thing. The aim, roughly, is to head into the heart of whatever is afflicting the world, which is to your southeast. You'll only know that if you read the game manual. It makes a throwaway mention to you should head southeast. Otherwise, you'll just wander around for ages wondering what the hell's going on, as I did. But it's quite open-worldy. And within this open world, there are smaller dungeons. I don't know if there's a big dungeon further on or something. No idea. I haven't got that far. But as you wander around, you'll find little caves scattered around here and there. A little cave full of floating eyeballs, which paralyse you. A little cave with a wolf pack living in it. Sometimes if you come across a ploughed field, you'll find a ratville, which is a sprawling warren infested by ratmen. That kind of thing. It's open-worldy, but with these pockets of dungeons and caves all over the place, and the whole thing is procedurally generated. Apparently you can also create spells from smaller spells and that kind of thing. As I said, I've barely scratched the surface. But there's a lot to this game, even if you don't fathom all the depth of it. The fact that it plays so differently from other games, and it's so customizable with customizable difficulty, different starting loadouts, different character classes, all kinds of stuff, really makes it worth a look. It does feel like an unfinished project, which is exactly what it is, but it's very, very much worth playing, in my view. And this has been one of my favourite roguelikes that I've discovered over the last few months. So that's my number 6, Vapours of Insanity, and it was very nearly higher, which means from here on, the competition is going to be much, much stronger. Number 5 is actually one of the first roguelikes I played. I think it was about the 4th, I would say, roguelike I played. And it's, by reputation, one of the most difficult, although I wouldn't necessarily agree with that assessment. It has a reputation for being brutally unforgiving. But I find it reasonably manageable once you start to figure it out. And it is certainly the game that started getting me into more standard roguelikes. That's not to say it's super standard, but before this I'd played Dungeons of Dreadmore, which is like a roguelike merged with a more traditional RPG. I'm not going to go into how that's the case, but it's not fully roguelike. I consider it a roguelike, but it brings in other things as well. And I'd played Doom RL, which, as I mentioned, is like a roguelike version of Doom. And I played Brogue, which is a little unorthodox in some ways. Ivan was the first one I played for This Is Ivan. It was the first one I played that was kind of like a standard roguelike, at least in the way it plays. It is graphical. I quite like graphical roguelikes. Some graphical versions look horrendous. I can't stand the graphical version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, for instance. It looks ghastly. I'd rather play the ASCII version. But for the most part, if the graphics look all right, I will favour a graphical version over an ASCII version. I don't think Ivan has an ASCII version, but in any case, it plays in gameplay style very much like a fairly traditional roguelike. 8-directional movement, random dungeon layouts, items lying around, equipment which you can equip to various parts of your body, and it uses the wield command, the equip command, the quaff command, all the usual fiddly commands that you'd expect from a traditional style roguelike. And it's difficult, but unlike Vapours of Insanity, which I said has what I take to be an unintentional sort of goofiness to it in places, Ivan absolutely embraces absurdity. There's a recurring theme of bananas throughout it. Someone on Reddit remarked to me that they don't understand why everyone's hilarious Ivan stories revolve around bananas. And basically your character comes from an island that really just has one industry. It exports bananas. So there's a recurring banana theme. For instance, I was trudging through the dungeon once, decided to... I forget whether I drank a potion, read a scroll, or prayed to one of the gods of the game. But it was something like that. And I was unexpectedly polymorphed into a banana golem. Which I don't pronounce Gollum. Gollum is a character from Lord of the Rings. Golem is the thing that's made out of stone or wood or whatever, usually. So I was transformed into a banana golem. And so I was a big, burly, humanoid creature made entirely of bananas. And I encountered an enemy which was a rabid ass. Presumably donkey rather than pair of buttocks, but either way. This rabid ass attacked me and bit off one of my banana legs. And I sat there looking at the message report that said the rabid ass bit off the leg of the banana golem or something. I thought, this game is completely preposterous. And it sets out to be. It revels in its absurdity. And at the same time, it's ridiculously hard. For me, it's not much harder than sort of, things like Rogue, NetHack, and Hack. It has that level of difficulty, but I actually find it easier to get through than something like Rogue or NetHack. As long as you don't take unnecessary risks, like randomly reading scrolls, you'll mostly be okay. It does have features like damage to specific body parts. And one of the things Ivan is known for, which I actually haven't seen an opportunity to try out so far, is things like you might lose a leg, and then you can graft on the leg of a defeated enemy onto yourself to replace your missing leg. I haven't really seen an opportunity to try that yet, but it is something I want to have a go at when the opportunity arises. So yeah, Ivan is tough, Ivan is ridiculous, and Ivan is my number 5 roguelike in my top 10 roguelikes of all time. It's a lot of fun, but expect it to be tough and unforgiving, but in a hilarious way that softens the blow somewhat. Ivan, number 5. My number 4 is Trauma RL, and I've mentioned this before. I did a video on it as part of the top 7-day roguelike picks from this year, which is still ongoing, actually. I have a couple more that I want to recommend that I just haven't got to yet. Real life has been busy lately. But I did a video on this, so I don't want to harp on it too much. But this is the second game by Flend. I said there were a couple of developers who have more than one game on this list. Zeno had Hyper Rogue and Vapours of Insanity. Flend had Princess RL and now Trauma RL. Trauma RL was Flend's entry to 7-day roguelike challenge this year, and it's the follow-up to an earlier roguelike of his, or spin-off perhaps, called Flatline RL. It's basically a science fiction-y thing. You wake up in the medical bay of some kind of space station or spacecraft, where things have gone badly wrong while you were unconscious. Something has happened. All the crew are dead or missing or otherwise just out of the way, out of commission. And you find logs scattered around, like data logs, documenting the stuff that's happened while you've been incapacitated. Things are going strangely. Weird plants are popping up and dripping goo. The maintenance robots are behaving strangely. All kinds of stuff is going on. So it has the feel of something like the beginning of Knights of the Old Republic 2, where you wake up and find that something bizarre has been happening while you were asleep. Actually, it's a lot like that, if you've played Knights of the Old Republic 2. That bit where you wake up at the beginning, and you're aboard a space station where everything's gone mad, but you don't really know what has happened or why. It kind of has that premise going on. And the reason it's so high up on my list, in the top half of this list, is because it's just so well done. You can pick up several weapons at a time, firearms mainly, but you do have the option for melee weapons. And using them is so smooth. Use F to fire, fine, but you change between weapons using the number keys, and it's so easy. I think it's the number keys. Anyway, that's beside the point. Easy keyboard shortcuts to change weapons, and it's so easy to do. It doesn't take up any time, so if you accidentally hit the wrong button, it doesn't cost you. You have very, very limited supplies of ammo, and fairly generous but also limited shield and health supplies. So you're always having to make tactical decisions and strategic decisions about whether to engage enemies or not. And you have to do things like figure out on the first floor that destroying all the cameras on the floor is required to cause the elevator doors to unlock. There's this very slight puzzle-solving element. It's also got key puzzles. If you listen to the episodes of Roguelike Radio concerned with this year's 7DRL challenge, Flend talks a little bit about how he was trying to create procedurally generated puzzles. And maybe it was... It might have been at the Roguelike conference thing, but there's an episode anyway where he talks about this, trying to create procedurally generated puzzles. And he mentioned that in this game it's quite simple, it's match the appropriate key to the appropriate door, but it's still something you don't see all that often. And from what I can tell, it's often from floor to floor, so you might have to go down into the Arboretum area in order to find a blue key to open up a door in the storage area. So that's actually slightly doomy, weirdly enough. And these are different every time. And the data logs that you find scattered around they're the same ones, but they're in different places and the details are different. So you might find one that says, I spotted a shotgun lying in this secured storage area off this other area. Or the next time you play the game with a new character, you might come across that message at some point, and it'll say, there was a shield thing in this storage area off this other area. So although the messages are the same, they appear in different places at different times, and the contents aren't always the same. But they do give you tips about the game. They might tip you off about where a certain key is or where a certain useful weapon is and that kind of thing. And you also get stuff that you can spend energy on. You have limited supplies of energy, but if you pick up the right bonus gear, you can expend some energy on shields or on improving your aim or speeding yourself up, various things. So although it's not complex, it does have these nice little touches of customizability to the way you're playing each time, which give it a lot more nuance than just slogging through the dungeon. And when you combine that with the attempts to integrate some kind of puzzly thought into it, and the fact that it looks great. Visually, it looks fantastic, particularly for a 7-day roguelike. Really distinctive recognisable visual style. It's very, very nice. All of this taken together very quickly bumped Trauma RL up into my favourite list. And that's why Trauma RL is at number 4 in my top 10. Number 3 in my top 10 is one that no one should be surprised to see here, if you've noticed that I have 90-odd episodes of Let's Playing this. That is Wozhack. Wozhack is a game I originally played on Desura. It's now available on Steam, and for some reason the Desura version seems not to be updated anymore, so it's actually older than the Steam version. But Wozhack is very inspired by NetHack, which is a game I don't like. Spoilers, you're not going to see that on this list. NetHack is arguably the most famous roguelike there is. It's quite an old one now and hasn't been officially updated in years and years. 10 years, 20 years, something ridiculous like that. I think it's 10 years. And Wozhack is very influenced by it. So as I've read or heard bits and pieces about NetHack, I've learnt a bit more about Wozhack. Things like Wand of Cancellation can remove curses from items. Learnt that from reading a page on the NetHack wiki and then tried applying it to Wozhack. So it does very much have a NetHack influence, but at the same time, it isn't the overbearing, head-bending, strategic ordeal that NetHack is, where you have to know on the first floor what you're going to be doing on the millionth floor and prepare accordingly, which is horrific and completely puts me off NetHack. It's like a manageable, graphical, more compact version of a NetHack-ish roguelike. And of course it takes a side-on view, so it looks a bit like a platform. It's not. It plays completely like a roguelike. But it looks different. It plays a little differently, because you move differently. But it's very much a roguelike. It's a very good one. It offers enough depth to keep you coming back and keep you wrestling with it for, as you've seen, over 90 episodes of Let's Play. And it's challenging, but for me at least, I always feel like I can figure out ways to make a bit more progress, which is something I don't always find in roguelikes. In many, really. I think, I don't know what I could try to improve the outcome of this the next time. That's not a problem in Wozhack. I'm always thinking of things I could do, try out, try using items together in different ways, and so on. Wozhack always feels like there are ways for you to try making more progress. And with a fairly large number of character classes on offer, I mean, what is it now? 16, I think, character classes available. There are all kinds of options for you to try out different builds and different kinds of runs, and to replay it, even if you've got to the end. I haven't, as no one will be surprised to discover. But it is definitely one of my favourite roguelikes. It does have some weaknesses. The fact that, for instance, as far as I can tell, you can't run away from enemies. That's a thing in roguelikes. A lot of roguelikes, particularly the big ones, allow you to escape from enemies. If you can get far enough away, if you can teleport away, if you can maneuver correctly, you can escape from enemies and they'll lose track of you. As far as I can tell in Wozhack, even if you teleport 10 floors away, the enemy will track you down like it has GPS on your buttocks, which is quite frustrating, and it means that you have to fall back on combat sooner or later. And it means that unlike a lot of roguelikes, or a lot of the big ones anyway, retreat isn't really an option, because all you're going to do is retreat, come across more enemies, and then be chased down by the ones you left behind. That's one of my criticisms about Wozhack, and one of the reasons it isn't higher than it is. But it is very good. It's a lot of fun. You do have to buy it, but the price is very reasonable for the amount of play you can get out of it, and the amount of play I have got out of it. And it's one of the few examples of a game that, if anything, works better with a touchscreen. The Android version, I think it's available on iOS as well, but I don't have an iOS device. But certainly the Android version plays very well, controls very well with a touchscreen, and it might even control better that way. So if you have an Android device, I certainly recommend having a look at Wozhack. There's a free demo version. It lets you get so far down into the dungeon before you have to pay to unlock. But otherwise, it's available on Steam. or an old version is available on Desura. Wazhack, my number 3 in my top 10. A lot of fun, a roguelike I've put a lot of time into, and I highly recommend it, to no one's great surprise. My number 2 is a game that's very little known, criminally so. And it's one of the few I've actually chosen to make a PayPal donation to. And because I was just looking at the site, seeing if the game is ever updated and such, and I saw there was a donate button, and I thought, you know what, considering how often I play this game, I think it deserves a bit of a donation. I actually would have liked to donate more, but you know how it is, you can only afford to donate so much at any given time. So I bunged a little donation the developer's way, and then a few days later I got an email from him thanking me for donating, which was nice, and saying, this is the first donation I've ever received for this game. The game is The Slimy Lich Mummy. Don't let the name put you off, or put you on, actually. The name actually really intrigued me when I first heard it. It's one of the reasons I checked it out. But I know it can seem off-putting because it sounds really goofy. The Slimy Lich Mummy is... it's fairly serious, but it does definitely embrace a certain goofy humour. Not to the extent that Ivan does, but it is very much there. For instance, I once... I think I read a scroll, and I was polymorphed into, and I quote, floating demon genitalia. And my icon changed. Because you're represented by an at in classic ASCII roguelike fashion, but otherwise it's kind of graphical. Graphics are simple, but they are graphics. And I was turned into something that was very, very clearly male equipment. I changed back after a while, but I dropped all my stuff, and it was awful. So it does definitely have a strong seam of humour running through it. Absurd, goofy humour. But it's also reasonably serious the rest of the time. Theme-wise, it's kind of cyberpunky, but with elements of fantasy to it. So, for instance, one of the items you can find is Axe of Trollish Bloodlust, which is strong but makes you illiterate. Even after you drop it, it's permanent illiteracy. Very irritating. But that's a fantasy-ish thing, but the rest of the time, you start off with a shotgun, and you find upgrade pods that tweak your genetic structure and that kind of thing. So it has a sort of blended science fiction and fantasy theme going on. And the main reason that I like this game as much as I do, enough to give it the number 2 slot, is that it is completely unlike other roguelikes I've played. Each of these differences by itself might not be enough to really make the game stand out, but when you put them all together, it makes for a completely different playing experience. So here are some things that the game does. It doesn't regenerate health. You find health packs lying around in the style of something like Doom. Just, that sort of classic 90s game style. You find health packs lying around, and you pick them up. And you don't have any maximum health as far as I can tell, so there's no, I'll wait until I've taken damage. Just grab a health pack. Your health would go up and up and up. Otherwise, your health doesn't regenerate. You also don't get any experience points. So, a lot of the time, there's no point fighting enemies unless you have to. They do drop some items and bits of equipment, but not that often. So a lot of the time, there's no point fighting enemies. Things like chainsaw ogres tend to drop grenades. So if you really want grenades, it might be worth trying to take out a chainsaw ogre. But it offers that choice every time. A lot of the time, you can dodge around enemies or not get close enough to set them off. And that means that you're not just chugging through enemies, sort of grinding for experience points or thinking, okay, I need to make sure I fight a fair few of them so that my character gets stronger. No, that's not how it works. And you get character upgrades only through things like finding upgrade pods, where you walk in and it offers you a choice of 2 upgrades, chosen at random. And they're things like bladed hands, which mean your unarmed damage is much higher, or the ability to teleport short distances. Or it upgrades your vision radius, and that kind of thing. So it's not simple, you now have more health. I think there are some of those around, but you don't see them that often. It's mainly, here you now have a new ability, or you now have a bonus passive effect of some sort. And you don't get any character levels. So combat, a lot of the time, is very much not what you want to be doing. There's also a lot about light. You're constantly running out of light because you have a limited supply of torches and lanterns, and although you don't go completely blind when you're out of light, it does seriously truncate your vision radius, which makes avoiding enemies a lot more difficult and forces you into more fights. There are a lot of secret doors as well. Unlike most roguelikes, there isn't a search command. You just bump into the walls to search. But that means that often you'll be in a place that seems entirely enclosed, and then you have to find a way out, and there are secret doors. There are often multiple routes as well. It won't be long before you find a floor that has at least 2 staircases leading out of it into different branches, which isn't that uncommon. Things like NetHack do that. But it's a nice touch to see it in a game that isn't as overblown and bloated as NetHack. And the game just does all of this nice, interesting stuff really, really well. There are a couple of oddities to do with the inventory. Sometimes you will try to... For instance, you open up your inventory with I, and you want to select the D item. Say it's a potion that's assigned to the letter D. So, okay, open my inventory, press D to select that potion, and instead you will drop whatever item you're hovering over at the moment, because D is also the drop command. So there are oddities like that could do some smoothing out. But for the most part, it's a really, really strong roguelike, and completely unlike any other roguelike I've played. I haven't had a lot of success with it. There is a point I get to that so far I haven't been able to get past. But it's a game I've put a surprising amount of time into. And it's just a really interesting, different, unique sort of playing experience. It's called The Slimy Lich Mummy, and it is my number 2 in my top 10 roguelikes of all time. Number 1. The coveted number 1 spot. Well, I don't know about coveted. I don't know whether anyone covets it. But if they knew about this list, no doubt they would. The number 1 is held by a game that I've mentioned a few times, but I've never made a video of it. If you follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen me tweeting about it from time to time. It's a game called Prime. And for all that I've said I hate NetHack, Prime is a game that basically sets out to be a science fiction NetHack. I can't really account for why I despise NetHack, but I love Prime. I don't know. That Prime just feels so much smoother and more manageable and just more fun and engaging and less of a dick, basically. Prime is graphical. I don't know if there's an ASCII option. There might be. I've never looked. But there is an ASCII version of this game, kind of. It's like an earlier, slightly less refined, considerably less refined version of Prime called Zappum. Zappum really did set out to be just a science fiction NetHack. Even the interface is basically the same as NetHack, whereas Prime has developed beyond that. But if you really, really need the ASCII, you could try Zappum. But Prime is the one for me. Presentation isn't amazing. It's fairly simple sprites and for the most part kind of bland map textures and things. But I don't know how long it is. I've only got down about 11 or 12 floors. And that I've only done a couple of times. But it's a lot of fun. It's unforgiving. More so than Ivan, I would say. The first couple of floors or so feel much more manageable. But it can be brutally, brutally difficult. And it can really punish you for the slightest error or misfortune, which can make it quite frustrating. That's certainly one of the drawbacks. It's easy to accidentally do something like electrocute yourself in a way that completely gets you killed, which can be very irritating. And there are some enemies where they will unexpectedly do really high damage to you on one particular hit and just wipe you out. So it's very easy to get unlucky in Prime, which is one of the downsides. But for the most part, it's a really strong, really ambitious-seeming roguelike. It has a lot of kinds of items and skills in it. A number of character classes. I think from memory about a dozen or so character classes. Each with their own different skills and different starting loadout. And even the same character class won't have the same starting loadout every time. My favourite one so far is the ninja. Space ninja, I guess, because it's a science fiction game set in a space station. So space ninja. And so you will always start out with a katana, but sometimes you might have X-ray goggles on. Sometimes you might have kind of aiming glasses that increase your accuracy and stuff. Just that kind of thing. You don't have exactly the same starting loadout every time, even with the same character class. And you can get psionic abilities, which is basically the game's version of magic. Even if you don't pick a psionic character to start with, you can drink ooze that you find in vats, and there's a chance that it will cause you a mutation, which will give you a psionic power at random. The psionic powers range from useful combat stuff to things that just make you more able to detect secret doors, and things of various degrees of usefulness, active and passive. And if you're drinking these vats of ooze to try and get a mutation, they also irradiate you. So, weirdly, radiation is one of the biggest killers in this game, in my experience. It's very easy to become irradiated by things, and you don't necessarily realise you've been irradiated until 10 minutes later you suddenly find that you're dropping health like mad, and your maximum health is just plunging down, and then you just become really sick and die. So Prime is very unforgiving, very punishing, but there's a lot of versatility to it. The items, you get floppy disks. You need to have a computer to be able to access them, and you don't find many computers, which is another of my criticisms. Floppy disks everywhere, hardly any computers. Find that quite irritating. But Prime recently received an update that smoothed out a lot of stuff and added some extra content. And it seems like quite a comprehensive roguelike with a lot of breadth as well as a lot of depth. There's a lot going on there, but it never feels overwhelming. Even if you understand just the basics of it, ranged combat, melee combat, drinking stuff from canisters, and just roaming around killing stuff, even if that's all you've got a handle on so far, you can still have a really good time with Prime. You will eventually get killed, but you'll still have a good time playing it. And the more you figure out, just from playing the game, gradually figure things out, the more you get that, the more you will start to succeed at the game. And I know that's also true of something like NetHack, which was explicitly the inspiration for Prime. But where it's frustrating and irritating in NetHack, and it feels like NetHack wants you to fail, and it tries to hide as much as possible from you, Prime is much more manageable and approachable, and it feels like you can uncover its secrets just as you go along. So, it's not without its flaws, but for sheer enjoyability, ambition, breadth and depth, Prime is my number one. Vapours of Insanity could perhaps hold this top slot if it wasn't so unfinished. Vapours of Insanity is very early on. Prime is still being updated occasionally, but it does feel more or less like a finished product. I've never got to the end, so I don't know whether it's actually completely finished, but it feels much more polished and rounded and complete. And that is one of the reasons why Prime is at the top. But just for fun and the amount of fun I have playing it and how often I find myself coming back to it, my number one in the top 10 roguelikes of all time, for now, is Prime. So, this has been my top 10 list of roguelikes. I know it's a long video, but I always knew it was going to be. This is my top 10 list for now of my favourite roguelikes. No doubt, if I come back to this in another 12 months, my top 10 will have changed. And there are several games that almost made the cut this time. Let me just have a quick scroll down my list here. Sill, for instance, was in contention. That was definitely a contender. Sill is a game based on the Silmarillion, like Angband, but it tries to stick accurately to the Silmarillion. really interesting game, but I haven't played it enough to really comment on whether it could be in this list. Something like Solstice. Solstice is a relatively recent game, still actively being developed. Nice, open-world roguelike with a lot of possibilities in it, including mountain climbing and various things. But again, it's constantly changing and evolving because it's new and actively under development. So that kind of excludes it. Plus, I haven't played it comprehensively enough to include it here. But these kind of things were definitely in contention. Aliens RL as well, by the same person who made Doom RL, is definitely worth a look. So there are all these games that nearly scraped into the top 10 that might actually come into the list if I come back to this in a year. But for the time being, this is my top 10 roguelikes ever to date. So quick rundown is 10 Rogue Souls, 9 Hyper Rogue 4, 8 Princess RL, 7 Doom RL, 6 Vapors of Insanity, 5 Ivan, 4 Trauma RL, 3 Wozhack, 2 The Slimy Lich Mummy, and 1 Prime. I will link to all of these games below if you want to check any of them out. I believe all of them except Wozhack are free to download. Wozhack can be purchased on Steam, or if you don't mind the outdated version, then on Desura. The rest are, I believe, entirely free to download. Some of them aren't entirely finished, some of them are buggy and have glitches and things. But such is the nature of ongoing development projects, and particularly roguelikes. But all of these 10 are roguelikes I think very highly of and have a lot of fun playing, although I don't think I'm actually good at any of them. So, thanks for watching, as always, and rejoin me the next time when I will be uploading more videos and undoubtedly more roguelike related stuff. For the time being, this has been my top 10 roguelikes. So until next time, bye for now.